This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. In Magic, most cards have a color that's related to their mana cost. Like, if a card requires blue mana, it tends to be a blue card. However, there are some cards that isn't true for. In fact, there's an entire mechanic that directly contradicts this. Because these cards are colorless, despite not only costing generic or colorless mana. Ghostfire was the first card to do this, and it was printed in 2007's Future Sight, a set which featured all kinds of little glimpses of what Magic might look like in the future. And give us a glimpse it did, because in 2015's Battle for Zendikar, the Devoid mechanic made its debut, and it appeared throughout the 3-set Battle for Zendikar block, and it returned recently in Modern Horizons 3. And Devoid simply makes it so a card is colorless in all zones, regardless of what kind of mana it costs. It appears exclusively on Eldrazi creature cards and cards associated with the Eldrazi. This makes sense flavor-wise, since the Eldrazi are typically associated with colorless mana. So while these particular cards cost colored mana, they're actually devoid of color. Speaking of things that are devoid of color, let me tell you about something that's the exact opposite, the graphic tee I'm wearing right now. It's from Into the AM, a special sponsor for this video. They're an apparel company that has been sponsoring content on the channel for several years now, and that's awesome, not only because they help support the channel, but also because I get to tell you about their great products. They're certainly best known for their vibrant and unique graphic tees like the one I'm wearing now, but they sell all kinds of other great apparel in their store, including jeans, button-ups, and a whole lot of other stuff. Right now is a great time to check out their store too, because their 4th of July sale has just begun, and if you use my link in the description and put in Nitzahone at checkout, you'll get an additional 10% off. Alright, now that we've talked about the colorful shirt that I'm wearing, let's return to talking about a mechanic that's all about colorless. While Devoid may seem at first to just be a flavor thing for Eldrazi, there are actually some pretty serious benefits to a card being colorless. Notably, it means the card can ignore any kind of effect that hates on a particular color. For example, cards like Ghostfire and Reality Hemorrhage don't really care if a creature has protection from red, nor can they be countered by something like Blue Elemental Blast. While it's fairly obvious that Eldrazi that like colorless cards, like glaring Fleshraker, would like the Devoid mechanic, so does something like Curator Beastie. So there are actually lots of payoffs available for these seemingly not colorless cards. To be eligible for this video, a card had to cost colored mana but be colorless anyway. This mostly means a Devoid mechanic plus Ghostfire. In all, there are 134 cards in Magic that meet this requirement, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. Here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. At number 10, it's Eldrazi Obligator. For 2 generic and a red, it's a 3/1 with haste, and when you cast it, you can pay 1 generic and a colorless to gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap that creature, and give it haste until end of turn. Adding a haste body to the board and temporarily stealing your opponent's creature can result in you doing a ton of damage out of nowhere, especially if the creature you steal is huge and was going to be trying to block your stuff. You can also run this out on 3 when that's good for you, making this have 2 different modes. Notably, as with other Eldrazi, this is actually a casts trigger, which does mean it's harder to abuse than an enters trigger, but it also means that even if the Obligator doesn't resolve, you still get the effect. While in Standard, it saw play primarily in red aggro decks, and it also caught on very quickly in Modern and Legacy, where it was part of one of the most broken decks in the history of Modern. These Eldrazi aggro decks combined Eldrazi Temple and Eye of Ugin, and played them alongside the cheap Eldrazi from Battle for Zendikar block, like the Obligator, who was pretty freaking insane when you could cast it really early and easily produce mana to pay for its cast trigger. This is a case where Devoid was really important, since Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple only work with colorless Eldrazi. Ultimately, these decks were so dominant that Eye of Ugin got banned in Modern, and once that happened, the Obligator saw only sporadic play in the Eldrazi decks in the format, which typically no longer played red. It also didn't really stick around as a card for Legacy Eldrazi decks. However, it found some success in Pioneer mono-red aggro, and it's recently enjoyed a resurgence in Modern, with the printing of some super powerful Eldrazi payoffs and Eldrazi creatures in Modern Horizons 3. The most notable of these for the Obligator are Eldrazi Linebreaker and Ugin's Labyrinth. The Line Breaker gave you another super aggressive Devoid Eldrazi that cost red mana, which gave Eldrazi decks a good reason to bring back the Obligator too, and the Labyrinth gave Eldrazi a much needed replacement for Eye of Ugin, so Eldrazi aggro decks are back on the rise in Modern right now, meaning the Obligator has a good chance at moving higher on the list in the future. At number 9, it's Drowner of Hope. For 5 generic and 2 blue, it's a 5/5, and when it enters, you get 2 1/1 Eldrazi Scion tokens that you can sacrifice for colorless mana. The Drowner can also sacrifice Eldrazi Scions to tap creatures. Paying 6 mana for a 5/5 and 2 1/1s that have ramp upside and the ability to slow the opponent down and or get blockers out of the way is pretty good. It saw some play in Standard, where it typically appeared in control decks, which loved the idea of adding multiple bodies to the board to slow down aggro decks, while also having a pretty legitimate threat that could help you ramp into your scary win condition, Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger. Like Eldrazi Obligator, it also benefited from broken Eldrazi decks in Modern, which could power this out as early as turn 2, and could do it on turn 3 with regularity. However, unlike the Obligator, it stuck around in the post-Eye of Ugin Eldrazi decks, which continue to run blue. However, also unlike the Obligator, it hasn't really had a home in any format since 2019, so its position on the list is definitely in jeopardy. At number 8, it's Inverter of Truth. For 2 generic and 2 black, it's a 6/6 with flying, and when it enters, you exile all cards in your library and then shuffle your graveyard and it becomes your library. This design's intention was for it to be a super efficient creature that comes with a downside, and indeed, for the first few years of its existence, no one really wanted to play the Inverter because it wasn't worth obliterating your library for an easily killable 4-mana 6/6 flyer. However, a few years later, Thassa's Oracle and Jace Wielder of Mysteries came out, and the Pioneer format was also created, and all 3 of those cards were legal in the same format. Both of these blue cards won you the game when you had a tiny library, and Inverter of Truth was a perfect way to enable them. In other words, this card's downside became upside, and that was a problem. Dimir Inverter decks came to dominate Pioneer during the format's early history. For example, at the first Pioneer Pro Tour in 2020, 6 of the top 8 decks were Dimir Inverter. Ultimately, this resulted in Inverter of Truth getting banned, and it hasn't gained any points since then. Despite only being legal in the format for 6 months, the Inverter amassed an impressive 33 points in Pioneer in that short time it was legal there. At number 7, it's Catacomb Sifter. For 1 generic, a black, and a green, it's a 2/3, and when it enters, you get a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion token that can be sacrificed for colorless mana. And whenever a creature you control dies, you scry 1. This gives you a great rate for 2 bodies, especially with a bunch of upside. This has led to it finding significant success in both Standard and Pioneer, where it tends to show up in decks that can leverage the Sifter's sacrifice ability. For example, Rally the Ancestors decks were all about sacrificing the entire board with Zulaport Cutthroat in play, and then using Rally to get all of your stuff back and do it again. It's also been played in Pioneer sacrifice decks, particularly in the Jund variants. These decks also run the Cutthroat, but can win in a wider variety of ways, like with Bolas's Citadel plus sacrifice payoffs like Mayhem Devil. While the Sifter doesn't have any top 8 so far in 2025, it's a powerful card that can enable sacrifice combos, so it's hard to imagine it'll ever be done putting up top 8s entirely. At number 6, it's Crumble to Dust, the first non-creature Devoid card we've seen on the list. For 3 generic and a red, it's a sorcery that exiles target non-basic land, and then you search up every copy of that land in your opponent's hand, library, and graveyard and exile them. Basically, if your opponent is highly reliant on having some specific land for their game plan, Crumble to Dust is one of the best ways to put a stop to that nonsense. It saw a tiny bit of play in Standard and Pioneer, but it's been the most successful, by a wide margin, in Modern, where it caught on immediately after being printed. That format's Tron decks look to get 3 different lands in play, because those 3 lands combined can produce 7 colorless mana when they're all in play. And if you take away one of those lands get a massive downgrade. At various times, Crumble has also been good against Valakut and Field of the Dead decks in the format. For the last decade, Crumble to Dust has been a regular sideboard card in Modern, and it looks like that's going to continue. After all, there are still plenty of problematic lands out there, and it's one of the most surefire ways to deal with them. At number 5, it's Eldrazi Displacer. For 2 generic and a white, it's a 3/3, and you can pay 2 generic and a colorless to exile another creature and then return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. Blinking creatures with that ability has a lot of applications, especially because it lets you target any creature. That means you can use it on your own stuff to help your creature dodge removal or to rebuy their enter trigger, and you can also use it to stop an opposing creature from being able to attack or block for a turn. It can also enable combos, like it did in Standard, where it was played alongside fellow Devoid Eldrazi Brood Monitor, which would allow you to sacrifice infinite tokens, since you could sacrifice the Eldrazi tokens to the Monitor to pay for the ability of the Displacer, flicker the Monitor, get those 3 tokens, and keep going from there. This doesn't actually do anything on its own, but if you throw Zulaport Cutthroat into the mix, you have an instant win combo. It's also been played in Pioneer Collected Company decks, which themselves are loaded up with creatures with nice Inter's triggers for the Displacer to abuse. It's also been played in Modern Legacy and Vintage Eldrazi decks, and Modern Legacy and Vintage Hate Bear decks. While it may seem strange to think of the Displacer as a hate card, it is pretty good against some heavily played creatures in those formats, perhaps most notably Walking Ballista and Hangerback Walker, which it can outright kill, since it exiles them and then they return with no counters. It's also often played alongside creatures with strong Inter's triggers like White Plume Adventurer, which ultimately got banned out of Legacy, leading to the Displacer largely losing its spot in that format. Right now, it is still active in Pioneer, so it's likely to maintain a spot on this list. At number 4, it's Sowing Mycospawn. For 3 generic and a green, it's a 4/4, and it has kicker for 1 generic and a colorless. When you cast the Mycospawn, you search up a land and put it onto the battlefield, and if you kicked it, you can exile a land. Basically, it's capable of tutoring up any land and putting it onto the battlefield untapped, and if you have some extra mana, you can simultaneously take away your opponent's best land, which is a pretty nasty combo. This is a Modern Horizons 3 card, which means the only 60 card formats it's legal in are Modern Legacy and Vintage. It also means that it only came out last year, and it's already this high on the list. That's because it was a perfect card for Eldrazi decks in multiple formats. They tend to be reliant on powerful lands like the aforementioned Ugin's Labyrinth, Eye of Ugin, and Eldrazi Temple, and the Mycospawn's ability to grab those makes it feel like you're getting a whole lot more than just one land. The decks it has been played in also have the luxury of being able to run some toolbox lands to grab in the right situation, like Bojuka Bog against a graveyard deck, so the Mycospawn is incredibly flexible and incredibly powerful. So much so that it actually got banned in Legacy fairly quickly, but it's continuing to see heavy play in Modern and occasional play in Vintage, and has a pretty real shot at one day being the number 1 Devoid card in Magic, but for now it has a ways to go. At number 3, it's Transgress the Mind. For 1 generic and a black, it's a sorcery, and target player reveals their hand, and you choose a card with mana value 3 or greater, and exile it. So while this is a somewhat restrictive disruption spell, the fact it also exiles the card is a big deal against graveyard decks, or any deck that has even a little bit of recursion. Unlike the other cards on the list, which have seen significant play in non-standard formats, Transgress the Mind's top 8s all came in standard, and has been resting on its laurels for a pretty long time. As you can guess from its enormous score though, it saw very heavy play in standard, being one of the main discard spells used in the format. While it was a sideboard card for about half of its top 8s, it also saw plenty of regular main deck play. It was especially good against cards that give their controller immediate value if they ever cast them, like Gideon Ally of Zendikar and Siege Rhino, since it could get rid of them before the opponent could ever cast them. However, while its high score has been enough for it to be this high on the list, it is inevitable that it will slip off of it as more and more Devoid cards get printed, and as all the cards behind it continue to put up top 8s. At number 2, it's Worldbreaker. For 6 generic and a green, it's a 5/7 with reach, and when you cast it, you can exile target artifact, enchantment, or land. And when Worldbreaker's in your graveyard, you can pay 2 generic and a colorless and sacrifice a land to put it back into your hand. Worldbreaker provides a huge body that not much can attack through, and it will always have a target for its trigger, giving you a 2-for-1 up front, and when you add in the activated ability and massive toughness, it means Worldbreaker is not a threat that can be dealt with by conventional means. While 7 mana is a lot, it's always been played in decks that are up to the challenge. In Standard and Pioneer, it found success in ramp decks that could consistently get the breaker down on turn 5. Meanwhile, in Modern Legacy and Vintage, it's been played alongside all of that Eldrazi fast mana I've talked about in this video, with Modern by far the format where it's seen the most play. That's also the only format it's currently seeing play in. And at number 1, it's Kozilek's Return. For 2 generic and a red, it's an instant that does 2 damage to each creature, and if it's in your graveyard when you cast an Eldrazi creature spell with mana value 7 or greater, you can exile Kozilek's Return from your graveyard, and if you do, it deals 5 damage to each creature. So casting this card normally isn't super exciting. It's a more expensive Pyroclasm, which isn't all that exciting, even at instant speed, but this card's ability from the graveyard is just absurd because it gives you a board wipe you don't have to spend any mana on. And not only that, because of the way it triggers, you're also going to be adding a huge body to the board in the aftermath of doing 5 to everything. Just imagine casting Worldbreaker and wiping the board, a play pattern that happens, and you'll see just how insane this card can be. And it gets even more insane when you're casting your Eldrazi at a discount or using ramp, since you can get this trigger way earlier in the game. Throw in the fact it's Devoid, which means the usual red hate cards or effects don't work on it, and you have a card that is very difficult to deal with. Unsurprisingly, the return has been played in Eldrazi decks in every format but Vintage, and it's going to continue to rack up lots of points in both Modern and Legacy. Right now, it's definitely the Devoid card that has left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. So, those are the top 10 Devoid cards in Magic. Do you love colorless cards? If so, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at mechanics and keywords, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.